So I'm surrounded by notebooks putting the finishing touches to my 2020 Burgundy Vintage Report, but I know that there are some offers already coming up for the wines, and been having a few questions from Wine Advocate subscribers and from friends about, what's the vintage like. I think it's a very interesting vintage. I mean, the first big question that it poses when you're tasting the wines is how can such an extreme vintage, when many producers finished harvesting, not just started, but finished harvesting before the month of August was complete, produce wines that are so classically proportioned, so vibrant and so fresh. And that's really the distinguishing feature of the wines. When you taste the reds, they're very intensely colored, very saturated in hue, very vibrant, with low pHs, much lower pHs than 2019 and 2018 in general, despite the warm and extreme conditions. 27% more sunlight, on average about 1.8 degrees centigrade warmer than a standard year, and a hydric deficit of about 60%, so comparable but more extreme still than 19 and 18, yet fresher, more vibrant. In a year with drought, you would think there might also be some hydric stress. The wines could be rather sort of chunky and blocky, and the tannins could not be fully mature, but that really wasn't something I encountered particularly when tasting. And of course, there's always a concern about alcohol levels. Yet, in general terms, we're looking at half a degree less alcohol than 19s overall. Now, of course, there are some exceptions. There's some people who waited too long or were unlucky or whatever, and alcohol's got up to sort of 16% or so. But those are really the exceptions, and you'll hear sort of horror stories about them, but it's not representative of the vintage. When you taste at a big house like Jadot, and I taste over the course of 2 days over 100 wines at Jadot, you really notice the lower alcohols overall and the higher acidities, a fresher profile to the wines. The white wines, similarly, less extreme than 19. The yields were really rather high, certainly higher than 19. Not quite as high as 18, but it was a year when people were able to make the appellation maximum if they wanted. That buffered ripening slowed things down a bit. A lot of producers picked whites after reds this year, not invariably. Everybody has their own approach. A lot of rather boisterous fruit, but really nice structure. And I think the distinguishing feature of the whites for me, if for the reds it's these very saturated hues and vibrant, rather primary profiles, for the whites it's an equilibrium based upon tartaric acid. There was very little malic acid, so you get very little lactic acid. So the wines don't really have that sort of creaminess to the mid palate that you can get from that in a vintage like 17, where analytically the pHs of the 17 white Burgundies and 20s are very similar, but the profiles are totally different because 2020, you're based, the whole equilibrium of acidity is based on tartaric acid, which is a harder acid, gives more sort of chalky profile to the wines, and so the wines have this really chalky finish, sometimes almost drying, and I mean, something you find in some old vintages that were defined by drought, like 1976, or vintages when people added a lot of tartaric acid, which I don't, was not sort of generally necessary in 2020, but it gives them a very distinctive profile, these wines, and I think they'll be relatively easy to pick out in blind tastings, in the future. Of course, I'm setting myself up for being embarrassed on a regular basis now for the next 20 years. But by saying that, however, clearly a very high quality white vintage, I think up there in the conversation with 17, some people would say 14, 10, 8, whatever you like. I mean, and yet the paradox is it's from this incredibly early harvest and very warm vintage. Similarly, reds, I see the wines. The wines are definitely more primary than the 19s were at the same stage. Is that because they have lower pHs, more tannin? Is it because the summer of 2021 was so cold and the cellars didn't, comparably warm up? Malolactics were often quite late with 2020s, so were the wines simply just less evolved naturally because of ambient conditions? It's sort of hard to say, but I think a lot of potential, also more structure, less of the sort of charm and sensuality that you find in 2019 that makes 2019 such an immediate and irresistible vintage. So 2020s are wines that you're going to want to think about aging for a while, in both colors, although the whites I think will be demonstrative out of the gates and just very nice for a very long time. Before it goes well with the closures and the élevage, of course. Now, how about the market? I think you don't need me to tell you that Burgundy prices continue their asymptotic ascent. I think what I'm hearing is that ex-domain prices for a lot of domains have gone up appreciably for the 2020s. Now, if producers want to capture more of the market value of their wines, I'm quite sympathetic to that. Even more sympathetic when producers want to valorize hard work, whether it's more innovative, ambitious viticulture, longer élevage, or whatever, and they need to get some of that investment back. I think that's absolutely justified. But of course, it's a rising tide that lifts or floats all ships, and everything's going to get more expensive. The news of the low to very low yields in 2021 are only going to pour gasoline on flames, and it's going to be a bit of a feeding frenzy, I think. So if you get offered an allocation next week of 2020s from good producers, don't wait for my report in 10, 15 days' time. You're probably going to need to move fast if you want the wines. But it's also, I think, going to be a stimulus for people to look at less historically famous appellations, to broaden their minds a little bit, because it's just kind of getting crazy. And that could actually be a good thing for Burgundy in some respects, as long as the market doesn't get too overheated. So happy shopping, and good luck. Make sure you have a glass of wine before you look at the prices this year, and I hope you can secure the bottles that you covet the most.